What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back again with another video. The history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has revolved a lot around archetype decks. You know, essentially decks that Konami made with cards that share a common theme and, more importantly, a common name to put them in the same archetype. Things like Tri-Brigade, Sprite, and Teledad, for example. The game has had historically a lot of decks revolve around archetypes, but a fun fact is that it actually has also a lot of decks that don't revolve around archetypes that were not really planned by Konami, so to speak, but just mishmashed together and happened to work on a competitive level. So today we want to take a look at the top 10 non-archetype decks of all time. Without further ado, let's dive in. Number 10. When people think about non-archetype decks, the first thing that probably comes to their mind is likely Go Control. This was a deck in 2005 that's also popularized as a format nowadays, because it was a lot slower back in the day. We didn't have a lot of combos. It was more just playing a bunch of power cards in one deck and just playing a lot of beatdown, a lot of back and forth. This format's been really popularized recently because of the fact that the modern format is a lot faster and people have taken a liking to the older formats where the Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a lot slower. Go Control essentially was a deck in 2005 that composed of a lot of the good cards at the time, things like Blackluster Soldier, Chaos Sorcerer, Magician of Faith, Night Assailant, DD Warrior Lady, so on and so forth, as well as a plethora of powerful spell cards like Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Pot of Greed, which were considered the holy trinity of spell cards at the time because they were so powerful. And back then, you know, before 2010, 2011, there weren't a lot of archetypes, so I think it's safe to say that most of the decks weren't archetype specific. They were just a mishmash of good cards. But Go Control was one of the first competitive decks and most memorable decks of that era that played a lot of powerful cards. In addition to the ones that were legal, they had some cool little tech cards like Metamorphosis, using it to distribute Scapegoat tokens to summon Thousandizer Strict to sort of suck up your opponent's monsters and control the board that way. As well as some powerful trap cards, Mirror Force, Torrential Tribute, so on and so forth. Later iterations of this deck, the ban list slowly started whittling down on cards like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Blackluster Soldier, because they were so powerful, they were later forbidden. But then the decks that were happened after that, like a couple of years later, were mostly modeled off of the Go Control deck and still were a mishmash of good cards. One thing that I think a lot of people really liked about the format is it's really back and forth. There wasn't any crazy combos or game shots outside of like a Heavy Storm plus the Blackluster Soldier to try and push for game. The game was really a lot slower. It was more safer. It took a lot of thought as well because there was so much back and forth. There were so many cards to play around as well. So many one-ofs in the format. And I think people just really liked how it worked. This was a era of Yu-Gi-Oh! That was very, very, very memorable and a lot of fun. At number 9, we have Chain Beat. Moving on to a more modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2013, where there were already a lot of archetype prevalent decks, things like Fire Fist and Mermails were running around. There just happened to be a deck that used a mishmash of good cards called Chain Beat. And how it worked is, just like its name, it relied on a beatdown strategy that also made use of chaining things, because there were these monsters in the deck called Wind Up Rabbit and Evil Storm's Thunderbird, which could essentially run away at will, so to speak. They have a quick effect where they can banish themselves until the next standby phase, and this could be done on either player's turn, so they would use this in tandem with cards that could take advantage of this. Things like Compulsory Escape Device, which was a trap that said each player chooses one monster they control, then shuffles it into the deck. So this is a non-targeting trap card that forces both players to remove one of their monsters, but you could activate Compulsory Escape Device as Chainlink 1 and then chain Evil Thorn Thunderbird or Wind Up Rabbit to that so they could banish themselves. And because the card has to resolve as much as possible, only your opponent would be shuffling back a monster that they control, and then your monster would come back on the following turn. It also played a lot of other good cards like Medolce Mageline to get an endless stream of monsters, so you can sort of inch out card advantage over your opponent as they're getting rid of their monsters and your monsters keep coming back, and sooner or later you have more cards than your opponent, so you can make a game-winning push. YCS New Jersey in 2013, Wilson Sang played a version of the deck using cards like Black Garden as well to have the enemy monsters, because big monsters was a hard thing for the deck to get rid of, as well as some other, you know, generic removal cards, things like Smashing Ground and so on, just to get rid of opposing monsters so they could win in a beatdown, simplified game state. Number 8, we have Chaos. Chaos was already a deck, I guess, since the beginning of Yu-Gi-Oh! Since Invasion of Chaos came out, there were a lot of good cards like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, or Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End, as well as Chaos Sorcerer. But this is more of a modern Chaos deck in YCS Kansas City 2011, won by Courtney Waller using his Chaos Stun deck. That basically was also a mishmash of good cards, which is a common theme that you hear throughout this video, but this one had a lot of good light and dark monsters, things like Thunder King Ryo, the Tour Guide engine, which could summon Sangan, and build a XYZ, things like Levier, the Sea Dragon, which allows you to special summon one level 4 lower monster from the Banish column, which you would have access to because it also played cards like Chaos Sorcerer and Blackluster Soldier, which you could banish any cards in your graveyard and then summon a Tour Guide to special summon back whatever you banished. It also played generically good cards, things like Battle Fader, Dita Warrior Lady, Kaku, the Ghost Destroyer, and Dimensional Alchemist, which was a newer card that came out in one of the structure decks at the time. This monster allowed you to banish a card from your deck, and then when it's destroyed, you could add back a banished card that it was banished by its effect. So it was essentially more or less a Chaos Stun deck that played a lot of good cards, but also made use of the Chaos engine and good light and dark monsters so they could make a game, push, or control the board. Yeah, lots of cool cards to think about. There were, of course, other Chaos decks throughout the era. There were things around the time of Go Control that also played things like Thunder Dragon, as well as the Chaos Sorcerers. But the most prevalent one that I can think of winning an actual event was in 2011. And fun thing to note is that this was actually the first time that the Chaos deck actually won. It was sort of off radar. Everyone else was playing decks like Plant Synchro, decks that were already common in the format, maybe X-Saber as well. But Chaos just kind of came out of nowhere and was surprisingly effective because no one really knew how to play against it and because there was a lot of good cards. And I remember playing this deck myself at the time, and I think I actually have a super old deck profile somewhere on the channel that was 11 years old.
We ain't gonna spend no time talking about the rules and shit, but pretty much I have 2 Raikou and a Lila. This is my mill engine, so I can mill all my shit in my graveyard so I can banish it for Chaos. And then we have 2 Dimensional Alchemist. This card is so good. All I have to do every time is just summon him, use his effect to banish a card on top of my deck, and then attack someone, and then get back my Chaos Sorcerer or my Blackluster Soldier, whatever the fuck I banished.
Number 7, we have Dragon Link. So this deck was, I think, around for some time since 2019, late 2019, just sticking around, evolving across a couple of iterations as the ban list started to hit things. At the beginning, we did have like the baby dragons that were soon hit. There were a mishmash of engines. Some people were playing Thunder Dragons in it as well in order to take advantage of Thunder Dragon Colossus, which could be summoned at the time easily, as well as Guard Dragon Agar Pain, which could special summon things like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss to negate monsters. This was later banned, but Dragon Link stuck around. There were a lot of good cards still, and the engine was really viable as new Dragon support came out. Striker Dragon was soon limited after that, and the deck, well, was surprisingly still effective, and even to this day, it's still somewhat playable now that we have more Dragon support like the Bestials, and generically good engine that you could build things like Borreload Savage Dragon, which was an easy negate, as well as cards like Heretic Seal of the Heavenly Spears, which allowed you to tribute itself to bounce any card on the field face up, non-targeting, and then special summon dragons, so you had an endless stream of dragons from your deck. Needless to say, I think dragons are one of the most supported archetypes, well, not really archetypes, but types in the entire game, so this deck will probably be around to stay for the time being as we see more and more dragons, and there will be a Chaos Dragon structure deck on the horizon as well, as far as I've heard the rumors, so maybe, who knows, Dragon Link will be meta again quite soon. Number 6, Antimatter. Stun deck strategies have been around for quite some time since the beginning of the game, obviously trying to counter the meta. There being a lot of good cards that could stop your opponent's meta game decks. And around 2010 especially was most memorable because there was a plethora of anti-meta cards that were released at the time. Coveted cards like the Doom Caliber Knight that was originally a prize for winning a Shonen Jump / YCS, but was later finally reprinted in Turbo Pack 01, so it was finally accessible to the general public, having a 1900 beat stick that contributed itself to negate the effect of a monster. At a time era where there weren't any hand traps besides DD Crow, which was not super common, so it wasn't as simple as someone dropping an effect veiler to bait the mandatory effect of Doom Caliber Knight to tribute it. It was actually a lot harder to use monster effects to bait it, and losing a monster effect as well as a monster because it does negate and destroy was actually pretty significant. There were also other good cards like Cyber Dragon, Banisher of the Radiance, which banished all graveyard strategies, Fossil Dyna, which prevented monsters from being special summoned, even King Tiger Wanghu, and of course, everyone's favorite, Thunder King Ryle, which was a 1900 light monster that prevented card strategies from adding to deck to the hand, as well as being able to tribute itself to negate the special summon, a non-inherent special summon of a monster like Cyber Dragon or a Synchro monster, which were all prevalent in the metagame. You also use cards like Smashing Ground to 1-for-1 the opponent. There were actually some decks that played the Gadget Engine as well, or Madolche Mageline, just to replace the card advantage, because as you trade 1-for-1 with your opponent, you could accumulate more cards, and sooner or later you whittle them down so you have a bunch of cards to play with and your opponent has none. But notably, there was a Antimatter deck that won Gen Con Indy in 2010, which played all of these monsters that were stated above, besides the gadgets, using Thunder King, Cyber Dragon, traps, Smashing Grounds, enemy controllers, all the good stuff just to prevent their opponent from getting an edge. And it was quite good in the metagame as well. I know it did top a couple of YCSs in America and Europe, so needless to say, Antimatter was a good non-archetype deck. And it's actually evolved nowadays into, as we get more and more stun cards, we get things like Necro Valley that are really good, as well as Grand Maju. It's sort of evolved and adapted to take on the mantle of Antimatter in the modern game world. We also had cards like Card of Demise that were soon released, allowing them to draw 3 cards. There are a plethora of good traps that were also good. And of course, Inspector Border, which is a modern day Thunder King, so to speak. It was really modernized anti-meta card that prevented your opponent from using any card effects and had 2000 attack and defense. So needless to say, anti-meta will probably be around to stick for some time as we get more and more stun cards that are effective against the metagame. Number 5, we jump back almost 13 years ago to 2009, Teledad. This was an iconic deck, one of the first tier 0 decks that basically dominated the metagame. As its name stated, it was basically a mishmash of really good dark monsters, including the emergency teleport card, which allowed you to special summon out high impact level 2 tuners, and the Synchros just recently came out in that era. They were obviously really dominant in the game. The Dad part stands for Dark Dragon, which was really powerful back in the day, being able to special summon a free Dark Dragon that had 2800 attack, as well as the ability to essentially wipe your opponent's board as you dumped more and more Dark monsters into your graveyard, not being once per turn, of course. Needless to say, it was really powerful and took over the metagame by storm. In SJC Houston in 2009, there were, I think, 15 out of 16 Teledads in the top 16, and only one Lightsworn being the other deck in that top 16. Of course, they only took top cut to top 8 at the time, but needless to say, Teledad was extremely powerful. This also used the Destiny Hero engine, using cards like 3 Destiny Hero Malicious, which is still really powerful in today's format that it had to be semi-limited. You would essentially dump this to the graveyard using your 3 copies of Destiny Draw to draw 2 cards. You could banish it to special summon another Malicious from your deck, and then you could activate one of your emergency teleports to summon Krebons to instantly make a powerful level 8 Synchro like Stardust Dragon or Colossal Fighter, or even just making powerful level 6s like Goyo Guardian, Gaia Knight, just big beaters that you could easily summon out, having extenders like Emergency Teleport. Just put it ahead of a lot of previous decks that were in the format, and needless to say, it was really fast. After getting all of your dark monsters in the graveyard by synchroing, you could control your graveyard, and then boom, out of nowhere, you have 3 darks, Dark Dragon hits the field, and it basically wipes away your opponent's entire board, so you can attack with the game-winning shot. There are also powerful cards like Crush card that were finally reprinted in Gold Series after being an SJC prize card that only exclusive players had access to previously. It allowed you to set something like a DD Crow or a Sangan and then wipe out your opponent's entire hand for the next 3 turns because it was very powerful at the time. Number 4, Monster Mash. This is a deck that was really funny because essentially it was more or less a deck composed completely of monsters. Usually the decks would have 38 or 39 monsters, but they would sometimes play 1 spell card, something like Heavy Storm or Cold Wave, just because it was very high impact. If you did happen to draw it, it was usually enough because the rest of your hand was monsters that you could make a game-winning push by getting rid of your opponent's back row. But there were also decks that played 40 monsters. This was essentially a mishmash of good Chaos monsters, including cards like Blackluster Soldier, Chaos Sorcerer, Tragodia, Thunder King Ryo, and more importantly, there was actually a card called Gallus the Star Beast, which was released in a GX Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force as a promo. This card allowed you to special summon itself from your hand by milling the top card of your deck, and then you get to burn your opponent for an amount equal to 100 times the level of the card that you milled. So if you milled a level 8, you'd burn them for 1600, which is pretty hefty. There was also something called an FTK that was built into the deck. That wasn't really played by all of the Monster Mash decks, but it was on the radar. By using a combination of Kwakimeru Doom, Gallus the Star Beast, and Gen X Ally Birdman, you could actually burn your opponent for a game by milling as many cards as you could from your deck. And because all of the cards in your deck were not spells, Gallus the Star Beast would always be able to special summon itself and burn your opponent successfully. The way it worked was you had to have these 3 cards in your hand and then be able to normal summon Kwakimeru Doom, which negates the effects of light and dark monsters. You would then go ahead and special summon Gallus the Star Beast by milling the top card of your deck and burning your opponent. From there, you would activate the effect of Gen X Ally Birdman in your hand, revealing itself for cost, and also bouncing back the Gallus the Star Beast to your hand for cost. Because Kwakimeru Doom is on the table, Gen X Ally Birdman will resolve without effect, but since the effect is a cost to bounce to the hand, Gallus the Star Beast is ordered to return to your hand, so you could then proceed to special summon it again. And because none of these cards were once returned because they were so old, you could do that until you milled your entire deck and then burned your opponent, whichever one came first. Alice Madalena actually got top 32 of YCS Providence with the machine version of Monster Mash. There are a couple of feature matches floating around, and it was pretty crazy what the deck could do unimpeded, because you could pretty much drop your entire hand on the table, given that most of the monsters they played were extenders and very, very high impact. Number 3, we have HAT, aka Hat, Artifact Trap Tricks Hands. In 2014, right after the Dragon Rulers got banned, and before the Shaddolls and Burning Abyss were released, there was a short little span that was quite popular with a lot of players that still sometimes play this older format. But there was a short span where a lot of decks were competitively viable because the relative power level of the decks were pretty low. Hand Artifact Trap Tricks was one such deck that wasn't archetype specific, rather you'd play a mishmash of a couple of engines, including the Fire and Ice hands, which were super effective to trade off boards, as you could crash them into an opposing board, get rid of their set spells and traps, as well as your monsters. It also played a Trap Tricks engine, which allowed you to make rank 4s easily, as well as search traps of your own to defend yourself. And also artifacts, which allowed you to control the game using artifact moral attack to non-targeting destruction effect to trade off monsters on your opponent's side of the field. It was a really diverse format, and this deck was especially safe because it did have a lot of toolbox to get rid of things that were running around the format. Obviously having access to good removal. A lot of the decks also played Soul Charge, which was just released in that format and was at 3. Hat was a really good control deck that was running around and keeping the meta in check for the couple of months that it was good before Shaddolls and Burning Abyss came out and basically devastated the metagame. But yeah, it was one of the only non-archetype decks that were around at the time, as after 2014, I think a lot of archetype decks started taking over. Number 2, Plant Synchro. If you were around in 2011, you probably remember how good Plant Synchro was, especially after Billy Brake was able to win back-to-back YCSs using the same, more or less, Plant Synchro deck. This was essentially a evolved form of Quick Draw Dandy Warrior that was played by Jeff Jones to win SJC Edison in 2010, which kind of came out of nowhere. But we basically got a lot of good plant support in things like Lone Fire Blossom, Dandelion Spore, Glow Up Bulb, that allowed you to basically chuck this engine into a deck and then build around that to make powerful synchro monsters like Trishula, and then recycle the pieces with Pot of Avarice. Of course, later we got the ever-powerful TCG exclusive Reborn Tengu, which was a monster that allowed you to special summon more copies of itself when it was sent to graveyard, and it would not miss timing, unlike other cards that basically miss timing when you try to synchro with them. This card was super high impact, and it allowed the plant synchro monsters to basically take advantage of other synchros like Hyper Librarian to draw cards, Formula Synchron, Black Rose Dragon, and you would be easily able to synchro summon using cards like Reborn Tengu that just recycled itself. And When you had Pot of Avarice, it just meant an endless stream of Reborn Tengu. Needless to say, Plant Synchro was very, very, very popular until finally late 2011 with Photon Shockwave came out a lot of new monster archetypes like Windups and Insectors, and of course Dino Rabbits, which kind of took over the metagame and inched out Plant Synchro. And number 1, drumroll, Dino Rabbit. Okay, everyone knows Photon Shockwave is one of the most powerful packs of that era, and Dino Rabbit was no exception. In late 2011, Photon Shockwave came out, and with it came some cute monsters that were actually very powerful in disguise. Rescue Rabbit was one of the monsters that allowed you to banish itself. Previously, we had Rescue Cat in the game that was also devastating and was later forbidden limited list. And of course, we got Rescue Rabbit. Everyone was excited. This card could allow itself to banish itself to special summon 2 dinosaur vanillas from your deck, which coincidentally could be overlaid into the all-powerful XYZ that came out in Photon Shockwave as well, called Evolzar Lagia. And of course, Konami didn't stop there. They gave us a TCG exclusive Evolzar Doka, which allowed us to negate monster effects. And previously, we also got Tour Guide from the Underworld. This was a card that was only $30 at the time because it was a waifu card. But then people realized that this card, hey, was really good with XYZs. You could get an instant level 3, rank 3 XYZ, which in this deck was super powerful. Leviator the Sea Dragon allowed you, as follow-up on the following turn, to special summon back the Rescue Rabbit that you banished on your turn previously, to banish it again, and then tutor out 2 more Dinosaur Vanillas and overlay for another Lagia or a Doka. Pretty crazy if you ask me. And ironically, this was actually the best deck of the format, inching out the other 2 best decks, which were Insectors and Windups, both of which were ironically Archetype decks. This was actually Dino Rabbit, you know, a monstrosity that Konami didn't really plan. It was more or less hyped up by the player base who realized the combos that they could do with a cute rabbit that could banish itself to special summon 2 Dinosaur Vanillas and combine themselves into a powerful XYZ. It was a little weird to say that the best deck at the time was a cute rabbit, expensive bug, a little girl from the underworld, and, well, a bunch of giant dinosaurs. But the deck was really, really powerful. And I even remember going to my first YCS Long Beach in 2011. There was 4,000 players, and a lot of players were playing Dino Rabbit. It was running around everywhere, and it was really, really powerful. Of course, back then we also had priority, which meant that you could banish Rescue Rabbit as a priority turn player, so they could not affect Valor. But this was later changed, thank goodness, so you could actually Valor a Rescue Rabbit. That's all I had for today. These are the top 10 non-archetype decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! I know there's some I missed, so if you guys remember them or have any suggestions, let me know in the comments below. Other than that, like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to make some more random Yu-Gi-Oh! videos. I'll see you guys in the next one. Deuces.